So welcome everyone again to another TTF Talks, and very importantly for us today, and we're very, very grateful to have with us David Franks, who is the head of Keolis here in Australia, and of course at the hub of what is the biggest growth industry in the country, and also probably one of the areas that we're all most focused on at the moment, public transport. So David, thank you so much for joining us.
No trouble, it was great to be here.
Thank you. So look, Australia's kind of living in its own little Australian bubble at this point in time. But what are we seeing in other parts of the world that have been through much of the virus now and are potentially starting to ramp up again? What are the learnings that you're seeing from the arms of the company overseas in terms of impact and how you manage getting people back on that public transport system?
Yeah, well, it's very, very difficult. Keolis itself operates in 16 countries around the world, from the United States through Europe, obviously here in Australia and in China as well. So it's seen it from all different directions. So there's no doubt in many jurisdictions, services have been stopped or suspended, or Sunday type services have been operated, whereas here we've continued to operate full services throughout the piece.
So just bringing it back to home, what are you seeing, for example, on light rail services? Because you run magnificent light rail services on the Gold Coast and Newcastle. What are we seeing in terms of, commuter and customer pickup on those services? Are they still being heavily used?
No, well, we've actually had a devastating impact on our services. At the worst, we were seeing just 5% of people using services that we would normally see. It's picked up a little bit in recent times, but we're still down to about 15% of people using services that would ordinarily use them.
So, and is the same for, the bus services as well, or have they been more strongly patronised during the period?
Buses generally have had a few more people travelling, but still they've been very badly affected. What's interesting, we've had some of the schools opening recently, so we're seeing in different parts of the country, we're seeing school bus usage growing quite considerably. So in Queensland and in New South Wales, we've got about 20 to 30% of our normal patronage, whereas in South Australia, we're up to about 80%, and in Western Australia, about 60%. So as the schools come back, we're seeing people beginning to use the transport system again. I think that's because there's not much choice. That's how people need to get to the schools. But that is not the case across the rest of our public transport systems, where we're seeing, as I say, quite devastating impacts on the numbers of people travelling by bus or tram or ferry.
And, difficult across the country. Each state is taking a slightly different spin on how they manage the process on public transport. What are the things that you think are going to work very well, and the ones that potentially you're more concerned about in terms of getting people back on the mainstream public transport system?
Well, the biggest issue we've got is here in New South Wales, where the government has put very stringent controls in place, requiring just 12 people to travel on a bus. In a ferry, just 45 people. In a tram vehicle, only 32 people. That's not the case in the other states, where people are being asked to use their common sense when they travel on public transport and make sure that they do their very best to social distance. The controls in New South Wales make life very, very difficult. Firstly, we won't be able to carry everybody as they all come back to work. But secondly, it puts real stress and strain on our staff who are trying to dissuade people from getting on a vehicle. I fear there could be some conflict situations occur as people demand their route to work and they're being prevented from getting it. So that's very, very difficult. The common sense approach in the other states, I think, is much more appropriate. And
from your perspective, because I know it's a case of, how long is a piece of string, because we're all going to be constrained until there is actually a vaccine or there's a better set of circumstances in terms of the virus. But how long do you think you'll have to work within, or are you calculating you're going to have to work within these changed circumstances?
Well, from what we've seen so far, even in China, where the restrictions started to lift the soonest, we're only seeing 40% of the people using the public transport system of the numbers that prior to the crisis starting. So it's going to take a long time. We're going to see, I'm fairly certain we're going to see some long-term impacts. So the sort of numbers of people using public transport prior to the COVID-19 crisis occurring is going to be lower, I'm certain. I think we're going to see a situation where people, as we see governments discouraging people from using public transport at this moment in time, we're going to see people travelling to work using their cars, or to do any of their travel needs. They'll be travelling by their own vehicles, I think, in the short term. There's a lot of encouragement to use new modes, so bicycles, for example, and walking. So we're going to see people do more of that. And I think it's going to, it will only be when the congestion on the roads gets to such becomes such a problem that people will start to think that it's time to go back to public transport. Working from home is going to stop people travelling. So I think we're very unlikely to see this recovery in the next year or so.
So you mentioned new modes, and you know, I know there's been quite a few announcements about bike riding and all sorts of things. But in terms of the place where the transport industry was before COVID, you know, I mean, it was a highly innovative industry here in Australia. Lots of, you know, mobility as a service and different modes being considered by governments. Where do you see that level of innovation going? Is that going to continue during this process? Are there in fact more opportunities for it?
Well, I think it depends how many companies survive. I mean that's the truth of the matter here. This is having a very, very serious impact on all businesses, and so I think that's a bit of an issue. I think that certainly people are being encouraged to try new things at this moment in time. So whilst that encouragement is there, people will do things differently for the first time. Just by way of an example, I've used Uber Eats for the first time ever, and I would never have done that previously. But it's just an example of how, you know, a bit of creativity around the place to keep businesses going, and you know, you start trying things. So certainly that's something I'll do again. I'm sure other people will, you know, try different ways of getting to and from work.
Well, I did notice too, there's been some reporting quite recently on the fact that the drone delivery services Google Wing has done fabulously during this period. Best way to get a cup of coffee, apparently. So there you go. From your point of view, though, what are the kind of longer term implications and changes for the corporate sector in this space? You know, is this going to change the way you do business potentially with governments? Is it going to change the appetite for privatisation, do you think, of things like bus services? Or could it just ramp it up as governments realise they do need to hand over to the private sector to get these things done?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think the style of the contracts will be thought about into the future. In most of our bus contracts, not all, but most of our bus contracts, we commit to operate a timetable, and we bid appropriately for that level of service that's operating. There is a real risk, I think, that as I've just indicated, there won't be so many people wanting to use public transport in the future. There is a real risk that timetables will have to change because there's not so many people. There's a real risk that timetables will have to change to suit differing travel demands. So I think that flexibility to change your timetables dramatically and still enable a private sector operator to make a profit is going to be quite challenged, because at the moment contracts don't allow that very easily. Even worse in contracts where you have revenue risk. So in Yarra, we are on the hook for 20% of the total revenue that is collected in Melbourne. And so, as I've indicated, at the worst, we were down to only 5% of people travelling on tram, and it was similar on the metro and V lines and across the bus services. So when you've got that level of impact, these businesses operate with very small margins. You just cannot get through with a significant revenue loss. So I think there will be some debate about how we get protected perhaps for this type of pandemic, or how we are able to resolve these issues when the contract model is not really designed for this major type of impact.
So obviously, this is going to take a while for recovery to stimulate, commuters back onto the public transport system. And even when they do, it's potentially going to be a changed model. We're all undergoing the world's biggest ever social experiment with working from home, etc. What do you feel would be the couple of things that governments or others could do at this point to stimulate the economy and potentially stimulate the growth and recovery of your own sector?
Yeah, well, I think let's be fair. The government has done a pretty good job in Australia. So when you look around the world and you see what is happening, what's going on, I certainly wouldn't want to be back home in the UK at this moment in time, and I certainly wouldn't want to be over in the States. But when you see what's been done, I think hats off to the decision makers, because there were some very difficult decisions early on that were taken, and they weren't. People were getting criticised for some of those decisions being taken, but I think you can only give credit where credit's due. That's the first thing. I think so the whole issue of stimulus type packages, I think, is on the agenda now. And what we see is getting through difficult times. I've seen it myself in my past experience in the UK. When you go through a recession, one way to get through a recession is actually to invest in your infrastructure, and I think that will be very much on the cards as we go forward. That's going to be good for jobs. That's going to be good for the industry that's using that infrastructure. So I think we'll see some rail-related schemes, road schemes. We've seen announcements last week in Melbourne. So I think that creating those stimulus packages, focus them in the right areas where jobs can be created and their long-term benefits is what we would want to see the government do.
Well, look, on that very positive note, David, can I thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to that public transport system ramping right up again and everybody getting back on the buses, light rail and trains as quickly as possible. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Margy. Thank you.
Thanks.